When other people tell their history, they come across as being patriotic. When other people talk about where they came from and who they are and what their history is, that's called patriotism. But when African Americans do it, or when black people do it, they're labeled as being militant. They're called rebels. They're called Afrocentric. So that's the big difference. Our history, for some reason, it becomes offensive to people. So we have to stop being afraid to tell what our true history is.
The studies will show that the dominant population here in America especially, and in Europe, have wanted to claim everything for themselves. And so they have made up a lot of stories as they travel to places. And as we know, all of the places that the so-called European or the white explorers traveled, when they got there, black people were already there. Some kind of black people, or yellow people, or red people, or brown people. You as a black man are the root of all of the civilizations. Every body they've ever found, every tomb they've ever raided, whatever it was, they found something symbolic of the black man, either our features, your nose, your mouth, your head, the way we looked, our hair, even braids, everything.
The makeup of a human being's self-esteem, self-image, and self-concept is not only based upon one's family history, but it's also based upon one's racial history. So when you look at the self-esteem of black people and black children, you can rest assured that at least 50% of how high or how low it is contingent upon positive information that they know or don't know about who they have been in racial history.
And over the last, I would say, 1,000 years, there has been a protracted effort and an ongoing effort by those in power, the European powers especially, to make sure that what we have done as an indigenous, or what we call autochthonous peoples, Earth's autochthonous peoples, is erased irrevocably from the minds of all our people.
Only a people who haven't learned how to respect themselves will let someone suggest themselves that they forget about their history.
If you know yourself, there's no way that anybody could ever do the things to you, or would you do the things to you and yours that we find ourselves doing. So that, and in many ways, I don't really think it's hidden. It's there. It's just that they're not allowing us to understand.
According to Dr. Ben, the original name of Africa was Alkebulan. Africa, the whole continent, was also called Ethiopia. As a matter of fact, the Atlantic Ocean was called the Ethiopian Sea. So there were several different names. Africa was really described by different tribes. It wasn't a whole monolithic society, but eventually they named Africa after a European.
Africa was not called Africa. It's actually named after the one who actually conquered the Carthaginians, Scipio Africanus. So they usually, the Roman types of system is that the conquering general gets to name the region he conquered. He gets his name to be placed on that region. So Scipio Africanus they named a certain terrain after him. So everybody just said, well, let's call it Africa or Africanus. But if you look to Dr. Ben's work, you'll find that it was called Kush, and you'll find it was called Alkebulan. It had many names: Ethiopia, which is essentially Greek, but a whole continent was once known as Ethiopia.
It's terrible, about just where math came from. All of the pictures that they've shown out of Africa, they've never really educated the Americans, white or black, about what really goes on in Africa, what some of the cities are really like. And that we're not running around over there with Tarzan, and when they show anything from Africa, even down to today, they pick the worst scenes, the most terrible situations, and they show those. But we have a proud history. But of course, what we did in Egypt 5,000 years ago, or what we did in China 35,000 years ago, is of no benefit if we don't understand what to do today and how that would help us to survive. We discovered the clock. we did discover the wheel. Black man has never been a caveman. You've never been in a cave. There's no history of it. You've ever been in a cave. We discovered mathematics and the alphabet and writing and all of those great things that they have built a foundation on, that they came and got and took back to other countries. We don't know what Africa would be like without the white influence. We don't know what it would be like without the Rockefellers and De Beers and all of them. We don't know what Africa would have been like. We do know that there were greater places in Africa other than Egypt, which is the only one they let us know about.
Concurrently and simultaneously during the Pyramid Age, there are great things happening in West Africa, but we very seldom. There are nations known as Dar-Tichit. Dar-Tichit is now, would geographically presently be located where Ghana is. We had the Nak culture, which is where we today would call Nigeria. We have the Monomotapan Empire in what today we call Zimbabwe. There are over 300 stone structures in southern Africa. And then you have that great structure in the great Zimbabwe that shows a direct relationship to the Grand Lodge of Luxor in Egypt. You have Puanit, which is in today's Somalia, Ethiopia. You have the Kush empires that are simultaneously happening. When Hatshepsut, the great Pharaoh king, although she was a woman, she was a Pharaoh king, sitting on the throne of Kemet, her cousin sits on the throne of Puanit, or what we call Somalia. There are great things happening historically across the African continent. You have the kingdoms of Kuba and Luba in Central Africa.
Mansa Musa was the king of Mali in the 1300s, very wealthy brother. During the dark age of Europe was going through a dark age, Africa was thriving. It was the gold capital. Mansa Musa was considered the wealthiest man on the planet at the time. Mansa Musa had a very well-known pilgrimage to Mecca, where he went to Egypt and went to Mecca and went through Egypt, and he gave out so much gold, it threw off the Egyptian economy. In today's terms, Mansa Musa gave away what would be the equivalent of $100 million in gold.
The African was the first race to circumnavigate the entire globe.
All over Africa, all over the world, the peoples of color that they call Africans, Alkebulanans, we were all over the world. So to say that in Ghana they had the Ashanti, they had, all over, we had powerful dynasties, so innumerable we couldn't even name them. Because remember, we had hundreds of thousands of years, and that's the secret. They cut us off at 6,000 because anything beyond that they could say is mystery. They could say is myth. So when you control the information, which is essentially what they've learned to do, under the Vatican they have about 6 to 8 miles of storage space that have all of our artifacts, and the Virgin Mother being black, all of the faces. We have to take apart the layers that are actually constructed in the lie. They're layered. For instance, you have a discipline in academia called Egyptology. Now, what is Egyptology? They say, well, it's the study of Egypt. Well, no, it's not the study of Egypt. Egyptology was created by the Vatican in order to make sure that there was a screening mechanism in place to explain away the truth that was being excavated every year, that kept giving them proof of who the ancient Kemites were. So Egyptology and Egyptologists are essentially agents of this information. Where else do you see a society, a people, and a way of life actually become a science? Unless you have specific purposes to make sure that the information that you are gathering on those people are given the proper perspectives to maintain the lie. So you don't get an Americology, you don't get Europology, you don't get Russiaology.
Richard Pryor, right? When he had his special back in 1977, there's a scene. They only allowed him to do 5 shows. In fact, they were rather ignorant because it took them 5 shows to realize what the brother was really doing. Richard Pryor, there's a scene where he goes in to the pyramids, and he is carrying the bags of the archaeologists and the anthropologists who are of European descent. And they're talking amongst themselves about what this find is and its importance, the greatness of it. And Richard Pryor is in this temple looking all around. And he begins to say, but all these people are black. He said, look at that guy over there. That guy look like my uncle. And he's just, you know, I mean, it's humorous. But what Richard Pryor is actually talking about is that, you know, these are black people in these pyramids, and these are the people that built these pyramids. He's saying, wait a minute, these people... And then all of a sudden, the camera begins to show the anthropologists of European descent, and they start to nudge each other because they realize, hey, you know, the guy carrying the bags is looking around and he's learning some things in here. So very quietly, you see them backing out of the pyramid, right? And Richard Pryor is still there talking about how great the pyramid is, and then all of a sudden, they show you the door close, and all of a sudden the scene goes black. Which means that was the blackout on the information for black folk to understand their history. This is what Richard Pryor was dropping on us in 1977. This is what actually has happened. Richard was telling us, this is what has happened to us. Because as you become conscious, and brother becomes conscious, and as a community we become conscious, the Europeans who know this are beginning to realize. So they're trying to shut the door on us.
African people established the first dynasties in Asia. When you look at old paintings of Eastern Asian people, you can see the African ancestry in their features.
The Japanese were formed when Ethiopians brought South Koreans onto the island and combined with the original people there known as the Ainu. The Ainu now, you're going to find the Ainu in the Philippines. They're going to be called Negritos. You're going to find them in Vietnam. They're called the Champa or the Montagnards. You're going to find African people throughout the Far East. Very dark complexion, very curly hair, wide nose, thick lip. You will also find those with straight hair. You will find those with a more aquiline nose.
Some of the first Buddha statues clearly had African features, classical African features. If you go to Thailand, if you go to Korea, if you go to Vietnam, you will see some of these statues up that has the classical African nose, classical African lips, woolly hair.
When we go to Asia, we see that the founder of the samurai warrior, okay, in Japan, all right, was an African. We found that the founders of the ninja system was an African. In fact, in Japan, there's a saying that if you don't have a little bit of African blood, you can never truly be a samurai.
Martial arts was established by a black Dravidian who was living in southern India by the name of Bodhidharma. The Bodhidharma, it was said that he walked from southern India into Asia, China, and on his way there, he would study the fighting mechanisms of animals, and he used that as a form of self-defense for himself, and that's where martial arts started. There was another guy named Tigwai who was an original master of martial arts, and if you look at old paintings of Tigwai, this dude looks like Lionel Richie. So martial arts was really established in Africa. Even during slavery in Brazil, there's a form of Brazilian martial arts, which is African martial arts called capoeira. And what they would do, the African slaves would practice this form of martial art, and they would disguise it as dancing.
When we look at the early pictures of most of the deities of Asia, nearly all of them bore striking resemblance to the deities of the Nile Valley civilizations. And even in their writings, you will see that even in Asia, not just Greece and Rome, but even in Asia, you see them paying tribute to the spiritual systems and history that they had learned in Africa. In fact, the Asian spiritual system is probably the closest approximate to the traditional African spiritual system. From the one, you get many, with the creator being manifested in all living organisms, be it a tree or a human being. That is fundamental to Asian thought, but it's also fundamental to African thought, which predated Asia.
When you go into these jungles in Bangkok, in the areas of Vietnam, when the Vietnamese, when they were fighting in Vietnam, they went into these temples, they saw nothing but these African faces. When they saw the black man dressed up like that, they thought that the Buddha gods had come back. All these black men dressed in these American faces, they were accustomed in the bush to these black faces, these black Buddhas. And when you go deeper into that information, you're only seeing black faces. You could go down into certain parts of Africa or down there, I forgot the name of the tribes, but in the Bantu, you could look at them and they have very high cheeks and their eyes are completely slanted. So you can tell where the Chinese people actually ascended from.